Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're embarking on a real deep dive.
Hmm.
We've got some truly profound source material here, exploring the very fabric of, well, the human psyche.
Absolutely. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, we'll get into why psychology is seen as the newest empirical science, uncover these ancient kind of internal images that guide
The
us,
archetypes.
exactly, and reveal the transformative journey of the soul. So, our mission really is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge for you.
Helping you understand how these sometimes surprising facts about our inner world can be a shortcut to knowing yourself and maybe the collective human experience a bit better.
Okay, so first up, our sources pose this really interesting question. Why is psychology the newest of the empirical sciences?
Right. It wasn't always seen that way.
No. And the sources suggest that for ages, humanity had, religious formulas for all things of the soul. Formulas described as much more beautiful and comprehensive than direct experience.
A kind of pre-packaged meaning system.
Exactly. But then these Christian symbols, over time, they wore out. They became mere objects of faith.
Lost their vitality.
Yeah, lost their flight of philosophical fantasy, leaving just the banal exteriority, as the source puts it.
So a kind of spiritual hollowness set in.
Which then led many educated Europeans to look elsewhere. Right? They felt drawn to the symbols of the East.
Like Indian divinity concepts or Taoist philosophy in China,
Yeah.
seeking depth again.
And what this points to, I think, is this fundamental human hunger for living meaningful symbols. It's not just about beliefs changing.
No, it's deeper than that. It's
Yeah.
about this core human need for symbolic truth that actually connects, that resonates.
So when the established systems, become impoverished,
When they lose that power to provide real meaning,
a void opens up.
exactly a void. And that void drives us to seek elsewhere. And, well, ultimately that search paved the way for psychology to start looking at our inner world, maybe more directly, more empirically.
It really makes you think, though, what happens when that direct experience of the soul, of its deeper realities, gets replaced by just formulas, by rote faith?
Leading to that increasing impoverishment of the symbolic, as the source calls it. It's a crucial question.
And this leads us perfectly into the next big idea, the collective unconscious and its archetypes.
Right. Fundamental concepts here.
So the collective unconscious, it's like the shared layer of the psyche, isn't it? Common to all humans, a reservoir of shared experiences, memories.
Inherited potential, you could say.
And within that, you have the archetypes. They're described as primordial images or even soul organs, like,
Built-in structures.
yeah, an a priori condition, like having a cerebellum or the kidneys.
Yeah.
They're just there, innate patterns.
And crucially, they aren't just subjective fantasies or, chimeras.
No, they're described as ambiguous, full of premonitions, and in the final analysis, inexhaustible. You can't pin them down completely.
And you see them everywhere.
Right, from the clear, ordered meaning you find in myths and fairy tales.
To the really confusing, seemingly incomprehensible stuff in, say, psychotic fantasy.
Though, even there, the sources say there's often a certain hidden coherence of meaning. It's not just random noise.
No. And this highlights a really key distinction the sources make about consciousness itself.
How so?
Well, they contrast our modern sort of differentiated awareness with what they call primitive consciousness, which is seen as much less developed.
Okay.
For the primitive person, thoughts just happen. They're not seen as originating from a deliberate will. The source says they're incapable of any conscious effort of will.
Wow. So a different relationship to thought itself.
Definitely. A kind of chronic twilight state, constantly surrounded by and even threatened by an extremely powerful unconscious.
Which explains the fear of magical influences and that sort of thing.
Precisely. Now, our sources stress that when our intellect translates these ancient archaic myths into modern psychological terms.
We're essentially creating a living and lived myth.
Yes, an abstract myth, but one that can be deeply satisfying for some people. It gives shape to these forces.
But there's a warning here too, isn't there?
A big one. If we lose touch with these powerful original images,
Their energy doesn't just disappear.
no, it snaps back into the unconscious.
Okay.
And this leaves us irremediably at the mercy of his conscience and his rational concepts.
Which sounds bad.
The source calls it a dangerous state, because reason, all by itself, without that counterbalance of its opposite, it has no meaning. It needs the tension.
Okay, so if we're talking about encountering these inner forces, one of the first ones we might bump into is the the shadow.
Ah, yes, the shadow. Everyone has one.
The source uses this great image. He who looks into the mirror of the water sees, first of all, his own image.
Your reflection.
Right, and the shadow is the face that we never show to the world, the hidden parts, the repressed stuff.
And meeting that part of yourself, that encounter with oneself, well, it's called the first test of courage on the inner path.
Because it's usually unpleasant, right?
Often, yes. Which is exactly why most people avoid it.
How?
By projecting it.
Yeah.
We project the negative around us, blame others, see faults everywhere but in ourselves.
So familiar. But the source offers some hope here, too.
It does. It says that admitting our own helplessness and weakness facing the shadow can actually trigger a compensatory reaction from the collective unconscious.
Meaning?
Meaning, helpful insights might emerge. Helpful ideas or revealing dreams can come forward when we stop projecting.
That's interesting. It connects to the trickster archetype, too, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The trickster is presented as a kind of collective shadow figure.
And history gives us some wild examples.
Oh, definitely. Like the medieval Festum Puerorum, the Feast of Fools.
Right, where clergy wore grotesque masks, sang indecent songs.
Played dice by the altar. Even neighed like donkeys in church during the Festa Massinorum.
Incredible. It sounds like chaos unleashed.
And the source argues these things reveal an undifferentiated consciousness, a state where opposites aren't so clearly separated.
So what happens to that impulse today when we don't have feasts of fools?
Well, the argument is when it's repressed, it gets projected onto other social groups and other people.
So we still do it just differently.
Which leads back to that question. Why do we keep blaming the other person instead of seeing the roots of this demonism within ourselves?
It's a powerful tendency, that projection. And speaking of these deeper inner figures, the sources talk about the anima and animus.
Right. The inner feminine for men, the inner masculine for women, though it's more complex than just that.
And they often show up connected to parental images or our experiences with our parents.
Yes, those early imprints are powerful shapers of these inner figures.
Which leads to this surprising observation in the text, that it might be harder to talk about God at the dinner table than to tell a salacious story.
Right. Why would that be?
The source says it's because the topic of God evokes great fear, precisely because it's so close to those deep religious ideas linked to parental imaginations.
Our fundamental experiences of authority, nurturing, meaning. It touches a raw nerve.
Exactly. It's too close for comfort sometimes.
And this connection to universal patterns, it goes beyond just personal parents. Look at the two mothers motif.
In the Leonardo da Vinci painting, St. Anne with Mary and Jesus.
Yes. Freud saw it very personally. Leonardo had two mothers, so that must be why.
But the source disagrees.
Strongly. Calls it inaccurate and completely false as a complete explanation. It's not just personal.
So what is it then?
It's an impersonal motif, an archetype found across cultures. Think of Heracles having a double descent or Egyptian pharaohs being twice born.
Ah, okay, so it's tapping into something much bigger.
A universal phenomenon linked to a deep human need. It shows the tremendous forces lurking in that mythical religious sphere.
Wow. And the maternal archetype itself is complex too, right? Not just nurturing.
Oh, absolutely. It includes nurturing and caring goodness, sure, but also things like orgiastic emotionality and even subterranean darkness. It's vast.
And having issues with this archetype, a mother complex can play out differently.
Yes, the sources detail different manifestations. For sons, maybe homosexuality, Don Juanism, and sometimes also impotence, various struggles with relationship and identity.
And for daughters,
It could be an exacerbation of all feminine instincts where, maybe her sole aim is to give birth. Or the opposite, an identification with the mother that blocks her own initiative.
or even a defense against the mother.
Right, a defense against the mother's supremacy that might push her towards intellectual development, maybe as a way to escape that powerful maternal influence. It's complex.
So moving beyond these sort of foundational figures, the sources introduce archetypes of transformation, things related to rebirth.
Yes, this idea that the psyche undergoes processes of profound renewal.
And it's not just presented as like a religious belief.
No, it's framed as a purely psychic reality, something real within us, even if it completely escapes our senses.
The source calls it the most prodigious reality in the human world. That's quite a statement.
It is, and they outline different forms this can take.
Right, like metempsychosis, soul transmigration, but without personal memory carrying over.
Then reincarnation, which does imply personal continuity, maybe even memories.
Resurrection, rising after death, often with a kind of subtle body.
And then renovatio. This is key renewal during life. Healing, strengthening, a psychological rebirth.
And finally, participation in the process of transformation.
Which is like indirect rebirth through rituals. Think of Mass or ancient mystery cults, receiving grace or a psychological boost.
It's a broad spectrum of renewal.
And this whole transformation theme is beautifully captured by the wise old man archetype.
The figure of inner wisdom.
Exactly. The source says he appears when you need intuition, understanding, good advice, decision-making, planning, things like that.
But you can't quite muster them yourself.
Precisely. When your conscious ego is stuck, the source gives this amazing dream example.
The theology student.
Yes, struggling with his faith. He dreams of meeting two magicians, a white magician, dressed in black, and a black magician in white.
Opposites.
And the black magician tells this story about a king opening a virgin's tomb and her bones turn into a black horse.
Which symbolizes
a descent into the dark, into the unconscious, to find new life, new energy. The dream, the source says, was a great secret being offered to him. Inner guidance.
Wow, that descent into darkness theme.
So,
It connects to the Qadir legend too, doesn't it?
absolutely. Qadir, the verdant one from the Quran,
In the 18th surah, Moses is traveling with his servant Joshua,
whose name means fish, often a symbol of the unconscious or instinctive soul,
and they forget the fish.
representing a loss of the instinctive soul, maybe because Moses was too focused on his conscious goal, kind of one-sidedness.
And then Moses feels fatigue, a loss of energy.
Exactly. The connection to the unconscious is lost, so energy joins away. And that's when Qadir appears.
Qadir representing the self, deeper wisdom.
Yes, superior wisdom. He does things that seem irrational or cruel from a human perspective, symbolizing that the path of renewal often involves things that defy conscious understanding. It's about renewal through death and darkness to a new ascension.
And it's interesting how Moses tells this story later.
He doesn't say, "I met Qadir." He uses the impersonal mystery legend of Dulkarnin, or Alexander the Great, and Qadir.
Why?
To avoid ego inflation. The danger of the ego identifying with the immense power of the self. It's a great psychic danger.
That makes sense. Even Qadir's actions, like building the brazen trench against Gog and Magog,
Those indeterminate and limitless enemy masses.
it points towards an eventual collapse, doesn't it?
Yes, the source links it to the idea that individual consciousness can ultimately be extinguished in the waters of darkness, reabsorbed into the whole. It's a profound journey into the depths.
Okay, so with all these deep figures and transformations, how do we even navigate this stuff? How do we integrate it?
Well, one key symbol the sources offer is the mandala.
The circular image.
Right. Described as a protective circle and a traditional antidote to chaotic mental states.
Like a container for psychic chaos.
Exactly. An instrument of meditation aiming to transform confusion into order and express balance and wholeness.
And they often appear spontaneously.
Yes, especially after chaotic, disordered, conflictual states linked to fear. They offer a kind of safe refuge, a space for inner reconciliation.
The sources give that detailed example, don't they? The patient, Mrs. X.
They do a whole series of her paintings. Initially, there's this golden ray coming from light, separating a spherical shape, perhaps the emerging self, from a dark, confused mass of stones.
Symbolizing liberation.
Yes. And interestingly, the magician figure may be representing the analyst,
Gets replaced by lightning.
representing intuition. And the patient herself becomes the sphere, the symbol of wholeness.
Then Mercury shows up.
As a serpent encircling the world, Mercury, the duplex figure, an antithesis in itself, embodying both spirit and matter as equivalent or even identical, bridging opposites.
The colors meant something too, right? Red and blue.
Red for blood and affectivity, emotion. Blue for the spiritual process, thought, perhaps, integrating both.
And that dream she had about the eye.
Removing a black spot from his cornea, maybe accepting a blind spot or flaw to reveal a small golden light inside.
Accompanied by that quote, "If your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light."
Highlighting the acceptance of the darkness and how illumination comes from within that acceptance.
Then later, her mandalas included her zodiac sign, Cancer, the crab.
Which itself symbolizes resurrection because the crab sheds its shell, also caution and foresight.
So it represented a kind of peak moment.
A solstice or climax in which a decision is made, the source says. A moment offering a broad perspective on the past and the future.
But the story has a sad ending.
Tragically, yes. It notes that 16 years later, Mrs. X died from breast cancer. It's a reminder that psychological integration doesn't grant immortality or prevent physical illness. life remains complex.
That's a really powerful illustration, though, of the process, and it leads us to the ultimate goal here: individuation.
Right, the culmination of this journey.
So what is individuation, really? What does it mean for you, the listener?
It's defined as the process that creates a psychological individuum, meaning an indivisible unity, a whole person.
Not just the conscious part we know.
No, it explicitly embraces the vastness of the unconscious, too.
And it's a journey, right? From
From an initial stage of personal infantilism, kind of being stuck in early patterns,
to the epiphany of the hero stage.
which needs careful navigation. It can tip into megalomania or a kind of suffering hero complex if the ego gets inflated.
But ideally, it leads to shifting the center of personality.
From the ego to the self, integrating conscious and unconscious elements.
The source calls it a definitive solution for freeing us from the prison of the unconscious, becoming whole.
But this brings up a really critical question, especially for us today. Why does modern Western culture seem so disconnected from these powerful archetypal forces?
Yeah, it feels like we've lost something.
The sources point to a long historical process. They suggest that partly to preserve strict monotheism and avoid Manichaean dualism, that idea of good and evil as equal powers.
Christianity ended up emphasizing an exclusively good God.
Transforming the more morally ambiguous Yahweh of the Old Testament and projecting all the evil onto the devil.
Okay.
But then often that external devil figure got sort of internalized, placed within humanity.
Making us the bearer of the mysterium iniquitatis, the mystery of evil.
Essentially making humanity responsible for all darkness. This, the source argues, led to a kind of degradation of the idea of the soul itself.
Denying its power.
Denying its power, its autonomy, fostering a rationalist worldview that tends to dismiss these strange powers, dismisses the evidence for dissociation or splits in consciousness, even when science points to it.
Creating what the source calls a highly dubious psychic state.
Yes, in an unbearable internal conflict, a bubbling mixture of impulses, blockages, and contradictory effects, because we deny so much of our own inner reality.
And this leads us right to the end, to a really powerful, almost prophetic warning, doesn't it? About the human spirit.
It does. It acknowledges reason is vital, a divine gift even.
Yeah.
But as an absolute mistress, reason alone has no meaning. Just like light needs darkness to have meaning.
And it warns that the human spirit, which we think of as so sensible, so ingenious,
Is tragically not aware of the demonism inherent in it. We're blind to our own destructive potential.
our own shatter collectively.
Exactly. And this unconsciousness leads us, the source implies, to do what we most fear and what we run away from.
Like wars.
Wars are the prime example given. We prefer blaming the other person, the other nation, rather than recognizing that maybe the whole world is possessed by these unacknowledged, unconscious forces.
The source really challenges us, asking if our focus on rational control or sensible reduction of these forces has actually led to a beneficial mastery.
And the answer seems pretty grim. Despite all our technology and progress,
A sinister nightmare weighs down the world.
driven ultimately by a self-destructive impulse rooted in this unacknowledged inner demonism. It's a sobering thought. Hashtag outro.
Wow. Okay, we've definitely taken a deep dive there into this fascinating, complex, and yeah, sometimes unsettling world of the collective unconscious, the archetypes, that whole profound journey of individuation.
Covers so much ground.
Yeah, from the very origins of psychology as a field to these ancient symbols that are still alive, still working in our modern minds. It's just so clear the psyche is way more intricate and influential than we usually give it credit for.
Absolutely. And I think the core insight from all these sources really is that understanding ourselves truly deeply means we have to embrace paradox.
The light in the dark.
The rational and the irrational. It's not comfortable, is it? It's challenging.
Definitely not always comfortable.
But the sources suggest it's essential for a truly integrated life. They remind us, quite powerfully, that there's no transformation of darkness into light, nor of inertia into movement without emotion. You have to feel it.
So wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening? Well, maybe the next time you have a really persistent dream, or feel a surprisingly strong emotion bubble up.
Or even just find yourself captivated by a particular story, a myth, a movie.
Maybe you remember that these could be subtle invitations, nudges from your own psyche.
Invitations to explore yourself a bit more deeply.
Yeah. So the question we leave you with is, What hidden treasures might be lying there in your own depths, waiting to be brought into the light?
And what wisdom might be waiting if you find the courage to really look into that inner mirror.